This is a reading from the book entitled Purgatory, explained by the lives and legends of the saints, by Father F. X. Shoup, S.J. Chapter 35. Motives for aiding the holy souls, excellence of the work, controversy between Brother Benedict and Brother Bertrand. When we so highly extol the merits of prayer for the dead, we do not in any way infer that other good works must be omitted. For all other works must be exercised according to time, place, and circumstances. The only intention we had in view was to give a correct idea of mercy towards the dead, and to inspire others with a desire to practice it. Moreover, the spiritual works of mercy, which have for object the salvation of souls, are all of equal excellency, and it is only in certain respects that we may place the assistance of the dead above zeal for the conversion of sinners. It is related in the Chronicles of the Friars Preachers, cf. Rossignoli, Merveille 1, that a spirited controversy arose between two religious of that order, Brother Benedict and Brother Bertrand, on the subject of suffrages for the departed. It was occasioned by the following. Brother Bertrand often celebrated Holy Mass for sinners and prayed continually for their conversion, imposing upon himself the most severe penances, but he was rarely seen to say Mass in black for the dead. Brother Benedict, who had great devotion towards the holy souls in purgatory, having remarked his conduct, asked him why he thus acted. Because, replied he, the souls in purgatory are sure of their salvation, while sinners are continually exposed to the danger of falling into hell. What more deplorable condition than that of a soul in the state of mortal sin? She is in enmity with God and bound in the chains of the devil, suspended over the abyss of hell by the frail thread of life that may be broken at any moment. The sinner walks in the way of perdition. If he continues to advance, he will fall into the eternal abyss. We must therefore come to his assistance and preserve him from this, the greatest of misfortunes, by laboring for his conversion. Moreover, was it not to save sinners that the Son of God came upon earth and died upon a cross? Saint Denis also assures us that the most divine of all divine things is to work with God for the salvation of souls. As regards the souls in purgatory, they are safe. Their eternal salvation is secure. They suffer, they are prey to great torments, but they have nothing to fear from hell, and their sufferings will have an end. The debts they have contracted diminish each day, and they will soon enjoy eternal light, whilst sinners are continually menaced with damnation, the most terrible misfortune that can befall one of God's creatures. All that you have said is true, replied Brother Benedict, but there is another consideration to be made. Sinners are slaves of Satan of their own free will. Their yoke is of their own choosing. They could break their chains if they pleased, whereas the poor souls in purgatory can but sigh and implore the assistance of the living. It is impossible for them to break the fetters which hold them captive in those penal flames. Suppose you met two beggars, the one sick, maimed, and helpless, absolutely incapable of earning his livelihood, the other, on the contrary, although in great distress, young and vigorous. Which of the two would deserve the greater share of your alms? Assuredly the one who was unable to work, answered Brother Bertrand. Well, my dear father, continued Benedict, this is just the case with regard to sinners and the holy souls. They can no longer help themselves. The time of prayer, confession, and good works is past for them. We alone are able to relieve them. It is true they have deserved these sufferings in punishment for their sins, but they now bewail and detest those sins. They are in the grace and friendship of God, whereas sinners are his enemies. Certainly we must pray for their conversion, but without prejudice to that which we owe to the suffering souls, so dear to the heart of Jesus. Let us compassionate sinners, but let us not forget that they have all the means of salvation at their disposal. They must break the bonds of sin and fly the danger of damnation which threatens them. Does it not appear evident that the suffering souls are in greater need and merit a larger share in our charity? Notwithstanding the force of these arguments, Brother Bertrand persisted in his first opinion. But the night following he had an apparition of a soul from purgatory, which made him experience for a short time the pain which she herself endured. This suffering was so atrocious that it seemed impossible to bear it. Then, As Isaiah says, torture gave him understanding. Vexatio intellectum dabit. Footnote 1, Isaiah 28, verse 19. And he was convinced that he ought to do more for the suffering souls. The next morning, filled with compassion, he ascended the altar steps vested in black and offered the holy sacrifice for the dead. Chapter 36. Motives for assisting the holy souls. Intimate ties which unite us to them. Filial piety. Simon of Athens and his father in prison. St. John of God saving the sick from the conflagration. If we are obliged to assist the holy souls because of the extreme necessity in which they are, how much greater does this motive become when we remember that these souls are united to us by the most sacred ties, the ties of blood, by the blood of Jesus Christ, and by the ties of human flesh and blood, whence we have been brought forth according to the flesh. Yes, there are in purgatory souls united to us by the closest family ties. It may be a father or a mother who, languishing in those horrible torments, extends their arms in supplication towards me. What would we not do for our father or for our mother if we knew they were pining away in some loathsome dungeon? An ancient Athenian, the celebrated Simon, had the grief to see his father imprisoned by heartless creditors whom he was unable to satisfy. What was worse, he could not raise a sum sufficient to effect his father's ransom, and the old man died in prison. Simon hastened to the prison and requested that they would at least grant him the body of his father, that he might give it burial. This was refused him, under pretext that, not having had wherewith to pay his debts, he could not be set at liberty. "Allow me first to bury my father," cried Simon. "I will then return and take his place in prison." We admire this act of filial piety, but are we not also bound to imitate it? Have we not also perhaps a father or a mother in purgatory? Are we not obliged to deliver them at the cost of the greatest sacrifices? More fortunate than Simon, we have wherewith to pay their debts. We need not take their place. On the contrary, to deliver them is to purchase our own ransom. We admire also the charity of St. John of God, footnote 1, March the 8th, who braved the fury of the flames to save the poor sick during a conflagration. This great servant of God died at Granada in the year 1550, kneeling before an image of Jesus crucified, which he embraced and continued to hold, clasped tightly within his arms, even after he had breathed forth his soul to God. Born of very poor parents, and obliged to support himself by tending flocks, he was rich in faith and confidence in God. He took great delight in prayer and hearing the word of God. This was the foundation of the great sanctity which he afterwards attained. A sermon by the Venerable Father John d'Avila, the Apostle of Andalusia, made such an impression upon him that he resolved to consecrate his entire life to the service of the sick poor. Without other resource than his charity and confidence in God, he succeeded in purchasing a house in which he assembled all poor, abandoned, sick, that he might give them nourishment for soul and body. This asylum soon developed into the Royal Hospital of Granada, an immense establishment filled with a multitude of the aged and infirm. One day, a fire having broken out in the hospital, many of the sick were in danger of perishing by a most horrible death. They were surrounded on all sides by flames, so that it was impossible for anyone to attempt their rescue. They uttered the most heart-rending cries, calling heaven and earth to their assistance. John sees them. His charity is inflamed. He rushes into the fire, battles through flame and smoke until he reaches the beds of the sick. Then, raising them upon his shoulders, he carries these unfortunate creatures, one after another, to a place of safety. Obliged to traverse this vast furnace, working in the heat of the fire for a whole half hour, the saint had not sustained the least injury. The flames respected his person, his clothing, and even the least hair of his head. God, wishing to show by a miracle how pleasing to him was the charity of his servant. And those who save not the body but souls from the flames of purgatory, is their work less agreeable to God? Are the necessities, the cries and moans of those souls less touching to a heart of faith? Is it more difficult to aid them? Is it necessary to cast ourselves into the flames in order to rescue them? Assuredly, we have every facility in our power for affording them relief, and God does not demand great efforts on our part. Yet, the charity of fervent souls inspires them to make the most heroic sacrifices, and even to share the torments of their brethren in purgatory. Chapter 37. Motives for assisting the holy souls, facility in relieving them, the example of the saints and of all fervent Christians, the servant of God, Mary Villani, the burned forehead. We have already seen how St. Catherine de' Ricci and several others carried their heroism so far as to suffer instead of the souls in purgatory. Let us add a few more examples of this admirable charity. The servant of God, Mary Villani, of the order of St. Dominic, whose life was written by Father Marchi, cf. Rossignoli, Merveille 41, applied herself day and night to the practice of satisfactory works in favor of the departed. One day, it was the vigil of the Epiphany, she remained a long time in prayer, beseeching God to alleviate their sufferings in consideration of those of Jesus Christ, offering to him the cruel scourging of our Savior, his crown of thorns, his cords, the nails and cross, in a word, all his bitter pains, and all the instruments of his passion. The following night, God was pleased to manifest how agreeable to him was this holy practice. During her prayer, she was wrapped in ecstasy, and saw a long procession of persons robed in white garments and radiant with light. They were carrying the emblems of the Passion and entering into the glory of paradise. The servant of God knew that they were the souls delivered by her fervent prayers and by merits of the Passion of Jesus Christ. On another occasion, the Feast of All Souls, she was ordered to work at a manuscript and to pass the day in writing. This task, imposed by obedience, was a trial to her piety. She experienced some repugnance to obey, because she wished to devote that whole day to prayer, penance, and pious exercises for the relief of the suffering souls. She forgot for a moment that obedience should take precedence over all else, as it is written, Melior est obedientia quam victime. Obedience is better than sacrifice. 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 22. Seeing her great charity towards the poor souls, God vouchsafed to appear to her, in order to instruct and console her. Obey, my daughter, he said to her, do the work imposed you by obedience, and offer it for the souls. Each line which you shall write today, in the spirit of obedience and charity, will procure the deliverance of a soul. It will be easily understood that she labored with the greatest diligence, and wrote as many as possible of those lines, so acceptable to God. Her charity towards the holy souls did not confine itself to prayer and fasting. She desired to endure a part of their sufferings. One day, whilst praying for that intention, she was wrapped in spirit and led into purgatory. There, amongst the multitude of suffering souls, she saw one more grievously tormented than the others, and which excited her most tender compassion. Why, she asked, have you to suffer such excruciating torture? Do you receive no alleviation? I have been, replied the soul, a great length of time in this place, enduring the most frightful torments, in punishment for my former vanity and scandalous extravagance. Thus far, I have not received the least relief, because God has permitted that I should be forgotten by my parents, my children, my relatives, and friends. They offer not a single prayer for me. When I was upon earth, being exclusively occupied with my extravagant toilet and worldly vanities, with feasting and pleasure, I cast but a passing thought upon God and my duties. My only serious desire was to further the worldly interests of my family. I am well punished, for you see, I am entirely forgotten by all. These words made a painful impression upon Mary Villani. She begged this soul to allow her to feel something of what she suffered, and at the same instant it seemed as though a finger of fire touched her forehead, and the pain which she felt was so acute as to cause her ecstasy to cease. The mark remained so deeply impressed upon her forehead that 2 months afterwards it was still visible, and caused her intolerable suffering. The servant of God offered this, together with prayers and other good works, for the soul to which we have just referred. This soul appeared to Mary at the end of 2 months, and said that having been delivered by her intercession, she was about to enter heaven. At the same moment, the scar on the forehead disappeared. Chapter 38. Motives for assisting the holy souls. Examples of holy persons. Father James Lainez, Father Fabricius, Father Nuremberg, a victim of his charity. He who forgets his friend after death has taken him away from his sight, never had a true friendship. These words Father Lainez, second general of the Society of Jesus, continually repeated to the sons of St. Ignatius. He desired that the interests of souls should be as dear to them after death as they were during life. Joining example to precept, Lainez applied to the souls in purgatory a large part of his prayers, sacrifices, and the satisfaction which he merited before God by his labors for the conversion of sinners. The fathers of the society, faithful to his lessons of charity, ever manifested particular zeal for this devotion, as may be seen in the book entitled Heroes and Victims of Charity in the Society of Jesus, from which I will here transcribe but one page. At Munster, in Westphalia, towards the middle of the 17th century, an epidemic broke out which each day swept away innumerable victims. Fear paralyzed the charity of the greater part of the inhabitants, and few were found to devote themselves to the relief of the unfortunate plague-stricken creatures. Then Father John Fabricius, animated with the spirit of Lainez and Ignatius, rushed into the arena of self-sacrifice. Putting aside all personal precaution, he employed his time in visiting the sick, in procuring remedies for them, and in disposing them to die a Christian death. He heard their confessions, administered the other sacraments, buried them with his own hands, and finally celebrated the holy sacrifice for the repose of their souls. In fact, during his whole lifetime, this servant of God had the greatest devotion towards the holy souls. Among all his exercises of piety, the one most dear to him, and which he always earnestly recommended, was that of offering the holy sacrifice of the Mass for the departed, whenever the rubrics permitted. As a result of this counsel, all the fathers in Munster resolved to consecrate one day in each month to the faithful departed. They draped their church in black and prayed with all solemnity for the dead. God deigned, as he often does, to recompense Father Fabricius, and encouraged his zeal by several apparitions of the suffering souls. Some besought him to hasten their deliverance. Others thanked him for the relief he had procured for them. Others, again, announced to him the happy moment of their deliverance. His greatest act of charity was that which he accomplished at the moment of his death. With a generosity truly admirable, he made a sacrifice of all the suffrages, prayers, masses, indulgences, and mortifications which the society applies to her deceased members. He asked God to deprive him of them for the relief of the suffering souls, most pleasing to his divine majesty. We have already spoken of Father Nuremberg, renowned as well for the works of piety which he published as for the eminent virtue which he practiced. His devotion for the holy souls, not content with sacrifices and frequent prayers, urged him to suffer for them with a generosity which often amounted to heroism. There was among his penitents at the court of Madrid a lady of rank, who under his wise direction had attained a high degree of virtue in the midst of the world, but she was tormented with an excessive fear of death, in view of purgatory which follows it. She fell dangerously ill, and her fears increased to such a degree that she almost lost her Christian sentiments. Her holy confessor employed every means that his zeal could suggest, but to no purpose. He could not succeed in restoring her to tranquillity, nor could he prevail upon her even to receive the last sacraments. To crown this misfortune, she suddenly lost consciousness and was reduced to the last extremity. The father, justly alarmed at the peril of his soul, retired into a chapel near the chamber of the dying woman. There he offered the holy sacrifice with the greatest fervor to obtain for the sick person time sufficient to receive the sacraments of the Church. At the same time, prompted by truly heroic charity, He offered himself as a victim to divine justice, to undergo during this life all the sufferings reserved for that poor soul in the next. His prayer was heard. The Mass was no sooner ended that the sick lady regained consciousness and found that she was entirely changed. She was so well disposed that she asked for the last sacraments, which she received with the most edifying fervor. Then, her confessor, having told her that she had nothing to fear from purgatory, she expired perfectly calm and with a smile upon her lips. From that hour, Father Nierenberg was afflicted with all manner of sufferings, both of body and soul. The remaining 16 years of his life was one long martyrdom and a most rigorous purgatory. No human remedy could give him relief. His only consolation was in the remembrance of the holy cause for which he endured them. Finally, death came to terminate his terrible sufferings, and at the same time, we may reasonably believe, to open to him the gates of paradise, since it is written, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy."